23,000 years ago, someone walked across the wet ground beside an ancient lake. They were not wearing shoes, they carried no map, and they had no idea that their footsteps would survive long after their entire world disappeared. Those footprints can still be seen today, preserved beneath the white desert of New Mexico. But when scientists determined their age, they discovered something disturbing. The tracks were made between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, during one of the coldest periods of the last ice age. Humans were apparently living deep inside North America thousands of years earlier than many researchers had once believed possible. And that created an enormous mystery, because at the time those people walked beside the lake, much of the road into America was supposedly blocked by ice. So how did they get there? To understand the problem, we must return to a world almost unrecognizable today. Huge quantities of Earth's water were trapped inside glaciers. Sea levels were approximately 130 meters lower than they are now. The shallow sea separating Siberia and Alaska disappeared, exposing an enormous region of dry land. This was Beringia. It was not simply a narrow bridge. It was a vast landscape of grasslands, rivers, hills, and cold tundra stretching between Northeast Asia and North America. Animals moved across it, including mammoths, bison, and other Ice Age mammals, and humans could follow them. For generations, small groups traveled farther east. They probably did not think they were entering a new continent. There was no visible border and no ocean crossing to announce their arrival. There was only more land. Families hunted animals, gathered plants, built temporary shelters, and moved as seasons changed. Some groups may have remained in Beringia for thousands of years before their descendants continued into Alaska and the rest of the Americas. Genetic evidence connects the principal ancestors of indigenous peoples of the Americas with populations that once lived in Northeast Asia and Beringia. But genetics also reveals a complex history of population separation, movement, and expansion rather than one enormous group migrating at a single moment. Crossing Beringia, however, was only the first part of the journey. South of Alaska stood two immense barriers. The Cordilleran ice sheet covered much of western Canada, while the Laurentide ice sheet covered an enormous area to the east. In some places, the ice was kilometers thick. Together, these glaciers formed what appeared to be a frozen wall across the continent. For decades, one explanation seemed to solve the mystery. As the climate warmed, a passage opened between the two ice sheets. Humans could have traveled through this ice-free corridor, entered the plains of North America, and then spread south. It was a simple story, but its timing did not work. Research suggests that although parts of the corridor became physically ice-free earlier, it did not develop the plants, animals, and other resources necessary to support migrating human groups until roughly 12,600 years ago. That may have been early enough for later movements through the continent, but it was far too late to explain people already living at White Sands more than 21,000 years ago. There had to be another route, and the most likely alternative lay along the Pacific coast. Instead of walking between the ice sheets, early travelers may have moved around them, following shorelines southward from Alaska. The coastline would not have been an easy road. Glaciers reached the ocean in many regions. Storms, freezing water, and powerful currents created dangerous conditions. But the coast also offered food. Fish, shellfish, seaweed, birds, and marine mammals could support human groups even where hunting on land was difficult. Coastal forests and kelp ecosystems may have formed a chain of relatively productive environments extending along the edge of the North Pacific. These people may also have used simple boats. Humans had already reached islands and crossed stretches of open water elsewhere in the world long before this migration. Traveling along the American coast would not necessarily require ships capable of crossing an entire ocean. Small watercraft could help families move around cliffs, glaciers, and frozen sections of shoreline. But there is a major problem with proving this idea. The Ice Age coastline no longer exists. As the glaciers melted, sea levels rose. Large sections of the ancient Pacific shore were submerged, possibly carrying campsites, tools, hearths, and other evidence beneath the ocean. The route that brought some of the first people south may now be hidden beneath tens of meters of water. This means the coastal route hypothesis is persuasive, but the earliest stages remain difficult to reconstruct. And then there are the footprints. At White Sands, the ancient landscape was nothing like today's dry gypsum desert. A large lake occupied the basin. Mammoths, giant ground sloths, camels, dire wolves, and humans crossed its muddy edges. Some human tracks appear to have been left by children and adolescents. Others form trails extending across the ancient lake bed. These were not just explorers rushing through an empty continent. They were families living there. Children walked through the mud. Adults collected food and carried supplies. People shared the landscape with animals that would later disappear forever. The footprints were originally dated using seeds buried within the same sediment layers. Critics questioned whether aquatic plants might absorb ancient carbon and produce misleadingly old dates. So researchers returned with independent methods. They dated pollen from terrestrial plants and measured when quartz grains were last exposed to sunlight. The results again supported an age of approximately 21,000 to 23,000 years. More recent geological research on the ancient lake has provided further support for human presence there during the Last Glacial Maximum. But one discovery does not provide the complete route. Perhaps people traveled down parts of the Pacific coast during brief periods when ice and ocean conditions allowed passage. Perhaps some groups arrived earlier than others. Perhaps people moved back and forth between Beringia and North America before a permanent population became established farther south. The evidence currently supports migration from Northeast Asia through Beringia, but the exact timing, number of movements, and routes remain active areas of research. The first journey into the Americas was probably not one heroic expedition. There was no single leader guiding hundreds of people across the continent. It was more likely a chain of thousands of smaller decisions made across generations. A hunting group followed animals into an unfamiliar valley. A family moved toward a distant shoreline. Children grew up in lands their grandparents had never seen. And slowly, without realizing the scale of what they were doing, humans traveled through North America, Central America, and eventually into South America. The journey may have taken centuries, or far longer. But each generation only needed to move slightly beyond the world known to the generation before it. Today, the old land of Beringia lies mostly beneath the Bering Sea. Much of the possible coastal road is underwater. The travelers left no written account of where they went or what they encountered. But beside an extinct lake in New Mexico, their footprints remain. Not weapons, not monuments. Just the marks of ordinary people walking across wet ground during the Ice Age. And those marks tell us something extraordinary. Humans reached the Americas earlier than we once thought. But exactly how they passed the ice, and what other evidence still waits beneath the ocean, remains one of the greatest mysteries in the story of human migration.